The summer heat clung thick in the air as Tom Grayson took his usual seat at the counter of Rosie's Diner, the small town spot he had called home for years. The place smelled of fresh coffee and bacon, the kind of comforting scent that made a man forget about the years behind him. He didn't talk much these days. He didn't need to. People here knew who he was, what he had done. They respected him. Which is why the moment the stranger walked in, Tom knew trouble had arrived. The man was loud, obnoxiously loud, talking into his phone as he strode toward the counter, his expensive suit out of place in a diner where most folks wore jeans and work boots. His voice carried over the quiet murmur of conversation, grating and arrogant. Yeah, I know," the man scoffed, waving a dismissive hand as if the person on the other end could see him. "But come on, Steve. This place is a dump. I don't even know why people live here." The regulars stiffened. A couple of old-timers glanced at each other, muttering under their breath. Rosie, the owner, paused mid-pour, shooting a glance toward Tom. He hadn't even looked up yet. "Hello, Mr. Pictures here, and before we continue with the story, please subscribe to the channel as it would allow me to continue with these stories. Thank you. Now, back to the story." The man, Mark Holloway, a city slicker with more money than common sense, kept going, oblivious to the way the air in the diner had shifted. "I swear, all these small-town folks do is sit around, talk about the good old days, and pretend they actually matter." He let out a mocking laugh. "Bunch of washed-up nobodies living in the past." Tom stopped stirring his coffee. The diner went dead silent. Mark finally noticed the shift, his gaze flicking around the room. His smirk faded slightly. "What?" he said, looking directly at Rosie. "What's with the looks? Don't tell me you people actually think this town is relevant." No one responded. No one needed to, because Tom pushed back his chair and stood. His movements were slow, deliberate, like a man who didn't have to raise his voice to get attention. The moment he turned toward Mark, the entire energy in the room changed. Tom wasn't the biggest man in the diner, but there was something about him, the way he carried himself, the way he stared through a man rather than at him, that made people pause. And Mark, for the first time since walking in, he actually shut up. Tom took a step forward, his voice low, steady, sharp as a knife. "You might want to think real hard about what you just said, son." Mark blinked, then scoffed. "Oh, and what's an old guy like you gonna do about it?" Tom didn't smile, didn't flinch. He just kept looking at him, that stare drilling into Mark like a bullet. "You got a real bad habit of running your mouth," Tom said, his voice calm. "Might want to fix that before someone fixes it for you." A few of the veterans in the back chuckled under their breath. Mark bristled, trying to salvage his pride. "Oh, what? You think I'm scared of some small-town tough guy? Newsflash, old man. I make 6 figures. I don't need to take orders from some..." Tom's voice cut through him like steel. "You ever been in a firefight, son?" Mark stopped mid-sentence. Tom stepped closer. "You ever watch a man bleed out in your arms while bullets fly over your head?" Tom's voice stayed low, steady, terrifyingly calm. "Ever wake up in the middle of the night because your body thinks you're still at war?" Mark swallowed. "What? You ever stand between a bullet and a man who couldn't defend himself?" Tom's eyes didn't blink, didn't waver. "Ever hold the line when the odds were stacked against you, knowing you wouldn't make it out, but you did it anyway?" Mark had no answer, because there was no answer. The diner was silent, every pair of eyes locked onto the 2 men standing inches apart. Tom didn't break eye contact, didn't let Mark breathe. "I have," Tom said simply, "and so have the men sitting behind you." Mark's face drained of color. Slowly he turned his head just enough to glance over his shoulder. The back booth was filled with veterans, men who had seen war, who had survived it, and who didn't take kindly to arrogant city boys running their mouths. Mark stiffened. Tom leaned in slightly, not threatening, not aggressive, just truth. "That coffee you're drinking, the freedom you got to sit here and talk all that nonsense, the life you live," Tom's voice dropped even lower, "bought and paid for by men like us." Mark licked his lips, suddenly very aware of how small he was in this room. He forced a chuckle. I was just making a joke." Tom smirked, and then he sat back down. The veterans in the back went back to their coffee. Rosie poured another cup like nothing had happened. And Mark? Mark stood there, staring at Tom like he had just looked into the face of something he didn't understand. Because for the first time in his life, he had met a real man. And he wasn't laughing anymore. Mark Holloway stood frozen, his face pale, his cocky demeanor slowly unraveling. He had walked into Rosie's diner thinking himself the smartest man in the room, the wealthiest, the most important. Now he felt small. Tom Grayson leaned back in his chair, taking a slow sip of coffee, his gaze never leaving Mark. There was no anger in his face, no raised voice, just the quiet, unwavering confidence of a man who had been through things Mark couldn't begin to imagine. The diner remained silent, tension crackling in the air like an approaching storm. Mark tried to laugh, but it sounded forced, brittle. "All right," he muttered, shifting his weight, trying to regain some control. "I get it. You all think you're heroes. That's cute." Tom didn't react. Mark let out a sharp breath, rubbing the back of his neck. "Look, I didn't mean any offense, okay? I was just..." Tom cut him off with a slow shake of his head. "Son, stop talking before you dig that hole any deeper." Mark's mouth snapped shut. One of the veterans at the back booth, a man with a Marine Corps tattoo on his forearm and scars that told their own stories, leaned forward, folding his hands. "You ever notice how the loudest men in the room are always the ones who ain't never had to prove a damn thing?" Mark swallowed hard. Rosie wiped her hands on a rag and leaned against the counter, watching with a knowing smirk. "Thing is, Mark," she said, her voice casual but carrying weight, "you might have made it big in whatever business you're in, might have more money than most folks in this town, but that don't mean a damn thing to the people sitting in this diner." Mark scoffed, trying to rebuild the arrogance that had crumbled the moment Tom stood up. "What? Because you all served? That makes you special?" Tom finally set his coffee down, his eyes locking onto Mark with a look so sharp it could cut steel. "No," Tom said slowly. "What makes us special is we don't have to tell people we are." Mark flinched. Another veteran chuckled under his breath, shaking his head. Mark shifted, his hands twitching. He had spent his life in boardrooms, controlling conversations, commanding respect through power and money. But here, none of that mattered. The power in the room had shifted, and he was at the bottom of the food chain. He tried again. "Look, I just don't see why you all expect people like me to worship the military. It's not like you fought for me personally." Tom's jaw tightened just slightly. "You ever been to Arlington, son?" Mark blinked. "What?" Tom's voice stayed calm, steady, but laced with something dangerous. "Ever walked through those rows of white headstones? Ever read the names of men who never made it past 20, who died in places you can't even pronounce?" Mark had no response. Tom's eyes darkened. "I have." Mark exhaled, his nerves starting to fray. "Look, I get it, all right? You've all seen some bad stuff. That doesn't change the fact that most people don't care about that anymore." Tom nodded slowly. "And that's your problem. You think just because the world kept turning, that means the sacrifices didn't happen. You think because you never had to pick up a rifle, you get to sit in a diner and mock the men who did." Mark clenched his jaw. "I wasn't mocking." Tom stood up again. The chair scraped against the floor, the sound sharp in the dead quiet diner. "You ever have to make a call that cost lives, Mark?" Mark hesitated. "No." Tom took a slow step forward. "You ever stare down a man with a rifle pointed at your head, knowing only one of you was walking away?" Mark's throat bobbed as he swallowed. "No." Tom took another step. "Ever feel the weight of a folded flag in your hands, knowing you gotta hand it to a mother who just lost her son?" Mark's breathing picked up. Tom was close now, not touching him, not raising his voice. But every inch of him radiated power. "Then maybe," Tom said, his voice low, dangerous, "you ought to watch your damn mouth." Mark stepped back instinctively, bumping into a chair. The diner watched, silent and still, like a courtroom waiting for the final verdict. Mark Holloway, the man who thought he owned every room he walked into, had nothing left to say. Tom let the silence stretch, let Mark feel it. Then, as if nothing had happened, he turned and sat back down, picking up his coffee. And just like that, it was over. But for Mark, the lesson had only just begun. Mark Holloway had never felt small before. He had built his life on power, on being the one in control, the one who walked into a room and commanded respect, not because he earned it, but because he could buy it. But here, in this small town diner with a bunch of old men who had seen more death than he could fathom, he wasn't in control anymore. And that terrified him. He tried to shake it off, to salvage his ego, to regain some sense of superiority. With a forced chuckle, he took a step back, adjusting his jacket, pretending like he wasn't rattled. "All right," he muttered, rubbing the back of his neck. "I get it. You guys love your war stories, but let's be real here. You think anyone outside of this town actually cares?" The moment the words left his mouth, he knew he screwed up. The diner went dead silent again. The veterans at the back booth stopped moving. Even Rosie, who had been wiping down the counter, froze in place. Mark felt the weight of their stares pressing down on him like an avalanche, but the heaviest of all was Tom's. Tom didn't move, didn't blink, didn't even change expression. He just let the words hang in the air, like a bad stench no one wanted to acknowledge. Then he exhaled, set his coffee down, and finally spoke. "You know what the difference is between you and me, son?" Mark shifted uncomfortably. "What?" Tom leaned forward slightly, just enough that Mark could feel the presence of a man who had seen things that would haunt another person for life. "The world might forget what we did, might not care about the sacrifices we made. Hell, people like you might walk around thinking we're nothing but relics of the past," Tom said, his voice steady, measured, every word carrying decades of unshakable truth. "But we don't fight for recognition." Mark swallowed hard. Tom's voice lowered, just enough to make every syllable land like a punch. "We fight so people like you don't have to." Mark didn't breathe, didn't blink. Because for the first time in his life, he understood what real power looked like. Not money, not success, not the ability to bark orders in a corporate office. Power was the quiet certainty of a man who had already stared death in the face and come out the other side. And Mark was nothing compared to that. Hello, Mr. Pictures here, and before we continue with the story, please subscribe to the channel as it would allow me to continue with these stories. Thank you. Now back to the story. A veteran at the back of the diner finally spoke, his voice low, rough. "I lost 12 men in a desert I never wanted to be in," the man muttered, staring into his coffee. "Didn't even get to bring all of them home." Another man, his hands scarred and worn from years of hardship, added, "I spent 2 years in a POW camp. Still have nightmares about it." A third, his voice a mere whisper, said, "I had to tell a 19-year-old kid he wasn't going to make it. He cried for his mom while he bled out in my arms." The room was thick with history, with pain, with memories that had shaped these men into who they were. And Mark felt like an intruder in a place he didn't belong. For once, he didn't have a comeback, didn't have a smart remark, didn't have the arrogance to brush off what had just been laid at his feet. All he had was the undeniable truth that he had never done anything in his life that truly mattered. Tom picked up his coffee again, took a slow sip, and set it down. "You can leave now, son." Mark hesitated, looking around the room. No one was smiling. No one was waiting for him to speak. They had already said everything that needed to be said. He gave a stiff nod, turned on his heel, and walked out. The bell above the diner door jingled as he stepped outside, the summer heat hitting him like a wall. But he wasn't thinking about the heat. He was thinking about the weight of his own insignificance. For the first time, Mark didn't feel important. And that feeling, it shook him to his core. Mark Holloway walked out of Rosie's diner like a man who had just survived a battle he never saw coming. The midday heat wrapped around him, thick and suffocating. But it wasn't the sun making him sweat. It was the words. The voices of those veterans still echoed in his ears, their stories wrapping around his mind like chains, dragging him down into a place he wasn't comfortable being. A place of reflection. He reached his rental car, gripping the door handle so tight his knuckles turned white. He had been humbled before, sure, business meetings gone wrong, negotiations that didn't pan out, but this was something else. This was humiliation on a deeper level. Because it wasn't just that he had been put in his place. It was that he had realized how little his place actually mattered. He sat in the driver's seat, gripping the wheel, staring straight ahead. He had a flight to catch in a few hours, and every bone in his body told him to just leave this town behind. Forget about it. Shrug it off. But he couldn't. Because for the first time in his life, he wanted to understand. With a deep breath, he turned the key, but instead of heading for the airport, he took a right turn down Main Street. He didn't know where he was going, he just let the road take him. 20 minutes later, he found himself outside the town's war memorial. It wasn't large or grand, nothing compared to the monuments he had seen in big cities. Just a simple stone wall with the names of local men and women who had served, a few benches, and an old flag swaying in the warm breeze. And sitting there, alone on one of those benches, was Tom Grayson. The old man didn't even look surprised when Mark walked up, didn't look smug, didn't look like he was waiting for an apology. He just nodded once, as if he had been expecting him. Mark hesitated, then sat down next to him. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. The only sound was the distant chirp of cicadas and the rustling of the flag in the wind. "I've never been to a place like this before," Mark admitted, staring at the wall. Tom just hummed in response. Mark shifted in his seat. "I guess I never really thought about it, what it meant, what you guys went through." Tom nodded. "Most people don't." Mark licked his lips, his pride warring with the unfamiliar feeling of guilt gnawing at his stomach. He had always thought of himself as a self-made man, someone who had earned everything through hard work and intelligence. But today had shown him just how small his world had been. "I was a kid when 9/11 happened," he said finally. "I remember watching it on TV, but it didn't feel real. The war didn't feel real. Just something happening on the news while I was going to school, worrying about college, my first job." He trailed off, exhaling. "It never really felt connected to me." Tom stayed silent, letting him talk. Mark clenched his jaw. "And now, I'm sitting here, realizing that while I was living my life, there were men out there dying, so I could." Tom finally turned his head, looking at him. "You don't owe us gratitude, son," he said simply. "We didn't do it for thanks. We did it because someone had to." Mark nodded, his throat tight. He looked back at the memorial, at the names carved into the stone. "But I do owe you respect," he admitted, "and I didn't give it." Tom let that sit in the air. Finally, he nodded. "Number you didn't." Mark exhaled, rubbing his face. "I don't know what to say." Tom chuckled, shaking his head. "You don't gotta say anything. Just remember this feeling next time you think you know everything." Mark let out a dry laugh. "That might take some practice." Tom smirked. "Well, you're young. You'll get there." They sat there for a long moment, just watching the flag ripple in the wind. And for the first time in his life, Mark Holloway wasn't thinking about his career, or his money, or his next big move. He was just thinking, and maybe, just maybe, he was finally starting to understand. The end.